Ted Bundy is a serial killer who is highly proficient at disguising himself. In social situations, he is articulate and possesses a humorous and charismatic demeanor. However, in reality, he was a calculating and cunning individual. He traversed 6 states, brutally murdering over 30 young women he had never met. It was highly ironic that he had even worked for the Seattle Crime Commission, writing a rape prevention pamphlet and volunteering to publicize it. His psychology professor spoke highly of him, writing in a letter of recommendation, "Mr. Bundy is without question one of the finest graduates of our faculty. I think he is the finest kind of Centurion graduate I have ever seen at the University of Washington. He is intelligent, capable, active, conscientious, and more like a professor than a student. He loves to learn, is easy to get along with, and will work hard." Ted was born on November 24, 1946, in Burlington, Vermont, the largest city in the state. His mother was Eleanor Louise Cowell, but the identity of his father has remained unknown. There have been numerous hypotheses regarding this matter. Some hypothesize that his biological father was most likely his mother's father. Louise Cowell claims that his father was a sailor named Jack Worthington, while others hypothesize that his biological father was an Air Force veteran named Lloyd Marshall. However, none of these hypotheses have been confirmed. At this time, he was known as Theodore Robert Cowell. To circumvent potential gossip, Samuel Cowell, his maternal grandfather, asserted that Ted was his son, a claim that was accepted by the rest of the family, given that his mother was pregnant out of wedlock at the time. Some reports indicate that Samuel Cowell exhibited violent and paranoid behavior, with a history of domestic violence, including the beating of his wife. Additionally, he was known to be racially abusive, beating family members and even the family dog when he was upset. Ted's Aunt Julia also recalled that he used to place knives next to her bed and laugh at her when she was a child. In 1950, Louise relocated with Ted to Tacoma, Washington, to reside with her cousin Alan and Jane Scott, subsequently assuming the name Louise Nelson. Nevertheless, there is no definitive proof that Ted and Louise endured domestic violence. In early 1951, Louise encountered 30-year-old Johnny Culpeper Bundy, who had served in the U.S. Navy as a cook at a Methodist-sponsored church event for adult singles. The two subsequently married that same year. Following their nuptials, Johnny adopted Ted as his son and assisted him in changing his name to Theodore Robert Bundy, the same name that was subsequently utilized in police registrations. Johnny was benevolent towards Ted, frequently taking him and his own children on camping trips and other outdoor activities. Despite his efforts to integrate Ted into the family, Ted consistently maintained a distance, adhering to the belief that his surname was Cowell, not Bundy. Despite the gravity of the crime committed by Ted, both Johnny and Louise continued to hold him in high regard and never wavered in their belief in his innocence. During his high school years, Ted self-identified as a troubled individual. He engaged in risky behaviors such as loitering in the neighborhood, searching through trash for pornographic images, and looking into windows after consuming alcohol. Additionally, it was alleged that as an adolescent, he exhibited a notable degree of social withdrawal and an inability to comprehend the necessity of interpersonal relationships and social interaction. Additionally, he was arrested on at least 2 occasions on suspicion of burglary. However, the case records were subsequently expunged in accordance with Washington state law following his 18th birthday. Ted's high school classmates attested to his social adeptness and popularity, as well as his reputation for good taste in clothing and exemplary manners. Ted graduated from Woodrow Wilson High School in 1965. He was awarded a scholarship to the University of Puget Sound, where he commenced studies in psychology and Eastern studies that fall. After 2 semesters at UPS, he elected to transfer to the University of Washington in Seattle, where he planned to major in Chinese. In 1967, Ted developed a romantic interest in a fellow student, Diane Edwards, who went by the pseudonym Stephanie Brooks. She was a woman of notable beauty and elegance from a wealthy California family, and Ted was initially incredulous that she was interested in someone like him. In early 1968, Ted terminated his studies, accepted a series of low-paying positions, and served as a volunteer in the Seattle office of Republican Senator Rockefeller's presidential campaign. Additionally, he was employed as a chauffeur for Arthur Fletcher, who is regarded as the father of affirmative action in the United States, campaigned for the position of lieutenant governor of Washington state that year. In August of that year, Ted attended the 1968 Republican National Convention in Miami as a delegate representing Rockefeller. Subsequently, Stephanie terminated their relationship, citing Ted's immaturity and lack of ambition as the primary reasons for the dissolution. Following the separation, she returned to California. At this juncture, Ted returns to his place of birth, Burlington, Vermont, and uncovers the reality of his family's relationship. He had originally assumed that his maternal grandparents were his parents and Louise was his sister. However, he subsequently located his birth certificate, which proved that Louise was, in fact, his mother. There are multiple accounts of how he located the document. The first hypothesis is that a relative provided him with the birth certificate, and the second is that he discovered the certificate on his own. However, this resulted in Ted developing a profound animosity towards Louise due to his perception that she had not acted in his best interests. Subsequently, a despondent Ted embarked on a period of respite in Colorado, followed by visits to relatives in Arkansas and Philadelphia. He also spent a semester at Temple University. He returned to Washington State in the fall of 1969, where he met Elizabeth Klopfer, who went by the alias Meg Anders. Meg remained in a relationship with Ted throughout the period in which he was committing the murders, yet she was unaware of his criminal activities. It was not until 1974 that she began to suspect that Ted might be the perpetrator when she observed a composite picture of the primary suspect in a newspaper and noted that it included the name Ted. Ultimately, following Ted's apprehension by the authorities, she became estranged from him and eventually disowned him emotionally. In the subsequent academic year, Ted re-enrolled at the University of Washington, majoring in psychology. This time, he distinguished himself as a gifted student, earning excellent grades and the admiration of his professors. As part of his coursework in psychology, he also served as a night volunteer at Seattle's Suicide Hotline, a suicide crisis center serving in the Seattle metropolitan and suburban areas. He encountered Ann Rule, a former Seattle policewoman and novice crime writer, who subsequently authored a biography of Ted and his criminal activities. According to the book, during this period, Ted exhibited no discernible abnormalities. Ann Rule characterizes Ted as a benevolent, sincere, and perceptive individual. In 1972, following his graduation from the University of Washington, Ted was employed by the gubernatorial campaign of Washington State Republican Party Chairman Daniel Evans. His role involved the note-taking of every speech delivered by Evans's principal opponent, former Governor Albert Rossellini, for analysis by Evans's staff team. Following Evans's successful re-election, Ted was employed as an aide to Washington State Republican Party Chairman Ross Davis. Davis held Ted in high regard, describing him as intelligent, assertive, and devout. In early 1973, despite mediocre test scores, Ted was admitted to the University of Puget Sound and the University of Utah School of Law on the basis of letters of recommendation from Evans, Davis, and several University of Washington psychology professors, ultimately selecting the University of Utah Law School. In the summer of 1973, Ted rekindled his romantic relationship with Stephanie when he traveled to California to work on Republican issues. She was surprised to find that Ted had become a conscientious, dedicated professional. Meanwhile, Ted continued to date Meg, unaware of the other woman's existence. In the fall of the same year, Ted took the relationship to the next level by convincing Stephanie to move in with him in Seattle for a period of time. The two discussed marriage after Christmas, with Ted even introducing her to Davis as his fiancée. In January 1974, Ted terminated all communication with Stephanie, neither answering her phone calls nor responding to her emails. When Stephanie finally contacted Ted by phone a month later and inquired about the reason for his abrupt change in behavior, Ted simply replied, "Stephanie, I don't know what you mean," and terminated the call. Stephanie never heard from Ted again until he was arrested. According to Ted's sources, his motivation was to prove that I could marry her. In contrast, Stephanie believes that Ted deliberately and cruelly rejected the relationship after the proposal in retaliation for her breakup in 1968. In August or September 1975, Ted became a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. However, he rarely attended services and failed to observe the majority of the church's commandments. Following his conviction for kidnapping in 1976, the LDS excommunicated him. When questioned about his religious beliefs following his arrest and during his trial, he stated that his faith was the Methodist Church, the religion of his childhood. The circumstances surrounding the inception of Ted's serial murders remain shrouded in ambiguity. He would offer conflicting accounts to different individuals and consistently evade inquiries regarding the temporal and spatial origins of these incidents. However, an investigation conducted by Detective Constable Robert Cape suggests that Ted's earliest murders may have occurred in Seattle in 1972 or in Tumwater, Washington in 1973. It is postulated by some that the disappearance of Anne Marie Burr, an 8-year-old girl from Tacoma, Washington, may be linked to Ted. Furthermore, official records indicate that Ted's first murder occurred in 1974, when he was 27 years old and had acquired expertise in forensic science, including the ability to avoid leaving incriminating evidence at the scene of a crime. From January 4, 1974 to approximately mid-June of that year, Ted perpetrated the kidnapping and murder of at least 6 female college students in a series of incidents. He gained access to the dormitories of his victims by feigning an intention to accost them and then assaulting them with a metal bat. Among those known were Linda Ann Healy, a 21-year-old student at the University of Washington pursuing a degree in psychology and broadcasting morning weather forecasts for local skiers. Donna Gail Manson, a 19-year-old student at Evergreen State University, disappeared after intending to attend a jazz concert. She was regarded as an exemplary student with a penchant for the flute and a proclivity for photography. Susan Elaine Ranko, aged 18, a student at the University of Washington, whose clothing was discovered in a washing machine following her disappearance. Witnesses recalled an individual with an injured arm approaching multiple women on campus that night, with Brenda Carol Bauer and Georgine Hawkins among the victims. Another victim, Karen Sparks, a dance student at the University of Washington, survived her serious injuries but sustained permanent physical and psychological trauma as a result of being beaten and sexually assaulted by Ted with a metal bat. Ted was employed in Olympia, the capital of Washington State, as the assistant director of the Seattle Crime Prevention Council. Additionally, he developed a manual on rape prevention for women during his tenure at this organization. Subsequently, Ted was reassigned to a role within the state's Department of Emergency Services, DE, which was engaged in the search for missing women. During his tenure at DE, he initiated a romantic relationship with Carol Ann Boone, a divorced woman with 2 children, who assumed a significant role in his life towards the end of his life. The culminating event in the series of serial murders occurred on July 14, 1974, when 2 young women were abducted in broad daylight at Lake Sammamish State Park in Washington State. 6 eyewitness accounts indicate that an attractive young male approached them and requested assistance in unloading his sailboat. 4 declined, while 2 followed him to his vehicle and promptly fled upon realizing that there was no sailboat. The vehicle in question was a brown or bronze-colored Fuchs Gold Turtle. At least 3 witnesses observed the man approach 23-year-old juvenile court worker Janice Ann Oteet and were convinced that Oteet followed him off the beach. 4 hours later, 19-year-old college student Denise Marie Naslund left the picnic site to go to the restroom and never returned. According to Ted, Janice was alive when he abducted her and forced her to watch him murder Denise. However, on his deathbed, he retracted this account. Subsequently, the Washington State Patrol created a sketch of the suspect and his vehicle based on the description provided. This sketch was then distributed via flyers by local newspapers and television stations. Ted's colleagues, Ann Rugg, his romantic partner Meg, and a University of Washington psychology professor all identified the sketches and informed the police that the suspect might be Ted. However, the detectives, who were inundated with upwards of 200 tips daily, determined that a seasoned student with no criminal history and a comprehensive understanding of the law would not be the perpetrator of such heinous crimes, and thus chose not to pursue the case further. On September 6, 1974, 2 hunters were engaged in hunting activities when they made the discovery of human remains, which were subsequently identified as those of Denise and Janice, situated in close proximity to a road approximately 3 miles east of Lake Sammamish State Park. In addition to the aforementioned remains, the scene also yielded several additional femurs and vertebrae, which were subsequently identified as belonging to the same individual. Ted was identified as the remains of another missing person, Jorgen Huggins. 6 months later, the skulls of Linda, Susan, and Brenda were discovered by forestry students from Green River Community College on Mount Taylor, located to the east of Issaquah. However, the remains of another victim, Donna, were never recovered. In August 1974, Ted, who had received an acceptance letter from the University of Utah Law School, relocated to Salt Lake City, thereby concluding his homicidal activities in Washington, D.C. However, he maintained contact with acquaintances in Seattle and continued to engage in romantic relationships with several women, including Meg and Carol. In September of that year, Ted initiated a new series of homicides, which included 2 cases that remained unsolved until just before his death. By the end of 1974, Ted had murdered at least 6 women, with a significant reduction in the age range of his victims. This included 4 17-year-old high school girls, including Melissa Smith, the 17-year-old daughter of the chief of the Midvale Police Department in suburban Salt Lake City. However, he also made one misstep. When an operator named Carol Derrick was lured into the vehicle by Ted, she immediately put up a fight after realizing that something was amiss. She then managed to open the door and jump out of the car to escape. In November of that year, later, Meg again reported Ted to the police after reading newspaper articles about the disappearance of young women around Salt Lake City. By this time, Ted's suspicions had been heightened. However, witnesses at Lake Sammamish State Park were unsuccessful in identifying him in a photo book, and there was insufficient forensic evidence to link Ted to the case. In 1975, Ted relocated the majority of his criminal activities to the eastern United States, specifically to Colorado. On January 12th of that year, Karen Irene Campbell, a 23-year-old registered nurse, vanished from the Wildwood Inn, where she had checked in while on vacation in the village of Snowmass, located southeast of Salt Lake City. 1 month later, the remains of Karen were discovered on the side of a dirt road outside of the village. They were naked and exhibited evidence of sharp-edged lacerations, as well as a blunt force injury to the head, which was determined to be the cause of death. The Karen Campbell case marked a significant turning point in the investigation, as her hair was discovered in Ted's vehicle, providing the first tangible evidence to prosecute him. From January 12th to early May, Ted committed 4 murders in Colorado and Idaho, including the Karen case. The victims were 26-year-old ski instructor Julie Cunningham, 25-year-old Denise Lynn Oliverson, and 12-year-old Lynette Doan Carver. In mid-May 1975, 3 D co-workers, including Carol, traveled to Salt Lake City to visit Ted. They stayed at his apartment for approximately 1 week. Subsequently, Ted returned to Seattle in early June, again for approximately 1 week. On June 28th of the same year, Susan Curtis, a student at Brigham Young University, went missing in Provo, which is located 45 miles south of Salt Lake City. The Susan Curtis case was the final murder for which Ted confessed, and he recorded his confession prior to his execution. With the exception of Melissa Smith and another victim in the Salt Lake City area, Laura Ann M., the remains of the majority of Ted's victims in Utah, Colorado, and Idaho were never recovered, as they were largely discarded in rivers in close proximity to him or interred in exceedingly remote locations. On August 16, 1975, Ted was apprehended by Utah Highway Patrol Troop Bob Hayward in the Salt Lake City suburb of Suwannee. Hayward had observed Ted driving erratically in a residential neighborhood during the early morning hours and subsequently pursued the vehicle at high speed after spotting a patrol car. Trooper Hayward confiscated a ski mask, a second mask fashioned from stockings, a crowbar, a bundle of ropes, an ice axe, handcuffs, garbage bags, and other items from the vehicle. Ted provided an explanation for the items, stating that the mask was for skiing, the handcuffs were retrieved from a dumpster, and the remainder were ordinary household items. In the course of searching Ted's apartment, the police discovered a guidebook to Colorado ski resorts, which bore a checkmark indicating that the Wildwood Lodge had been visited. As the evidence against Ted was insufficient to justify his detention, the police required him to post bail. However, Ted subsequently confessed that the police who searched his apartment had overlooked the photographs of the victims that he had taken with his Polaroid camera, which he promptly destroyed after posting bail. In September 1975, Ted sold his golden turtle to a teenager in the Midvale area. The Utah State Police promptly impounded the vehicle, which was dismantled and meticulously examined by the FBI. During this process, investigators discovered Karen Campbell's hair and trace evidence of Melissa Smith associated with survivor Carol Dirac. In November of that year, the 3 prosecutors responsible for overseeing the Ted-related cases convened a meeting in Aspen, Colorado. Approximately 30 detectives and prosecutors from 5 states were invited to attend. The meeting constituted an essential preliminary stage in the investigation of the Ted case, as state law enforcement officials exchanged and consolidated the available evidence and were convinced that Ted was the perpetrator they sought, but that they required further evidence to secure a conviction. In February 1976, Ted was tried for the disappearance of Carol Dirac. He waived his right to a jury trial, as advised by his attorneys, due to the considerable public interest in the case and the potential detrimental impact of a jury. Following a 4-day trial, Judge Stuart Hansen, Jr. found Ted guilty of kidnapping and sentenced him to 15 years imprisonment. In the same month, the authorities in Utah filed a murder charge against Ted for the crime committed against Karen Campbell. After a brief period of incarceration, Ted was transferred to Aspen, Colorado, where he was to stand trial. Prior to his final apprehension in February 1978, he had already achieved 2 instances of successful prison evasion. The first of these occurred on June 7, 1977, when Ted was conveyed from Garfield Jail in Glenwood Springs he was transported to the Pitkin County Courthouse in Aspen, 40 miles away, for his preliminary hearing. He did not hire an attorney, choosing instead to represent himself, and was therefore exempted from handcuffs and shackles by the judge. During a recess in the proceedings, Ted requested access to the courthouse library to conduct research on the case. He then utilized a bookshelf to obstruct the bailiff's view and subsequently exited the second-floor window, sustaining a sprained ankle upon landing. Subsequently, Ted proceeded through the downtown Aspen area, ultimately reaching Aspen Mountain, a location situated on the city's outskirts. There, he gained access to a hunting cabin, procured various items including clothing, sustenance, and firearms, and spent the subsequent night within the cabin. The following day, he continued his journey in a southerly direction. He attempted to reach Crested Butte, a small town located to the south of Aspen. However, he became disoriented and lost in the woods. After wandering aimlessly for 2 days, on June 10th, Ted reached Chestnut Lake, situated 16 miles south of Aspen. He broke into a camping trailer and stole food and a coat. Instead of continuing south, Ted proceeded north and back in the direction of Aspen. 3 days later, he procured a vehicle on the periphery of the Aspen golf course, where the combined effects of cold, hunger, and an ankle injury were becoming increasingly debilitating. Having been on the run for 6 days, Ted returned to Aspen in the stolen vehicle and was observed and apprehended by 2 police officers conducting patrol duty. Police recovered a map of the mountains near Aspen that was used by prosecutors to mark the location where Karen Campbell's remains were found in the car. This evidence proved that the escape was not impromptu but rather premeditated. Upon his return to Glenwood Springs Prison, Ted was encouraged by friends and legal counsel to remain calm until his trial. By this time, a significant portion of the extensive evidence presented to the court by the Colorado prosecution had already been deemed invalid by the court, and Ted's attorney were confident that if he did not create further complications, he could be acquitted in approximately 18 months. They believed that a setback for the Colorado prosecution would prompt other state prosecutors to reconsider their position. However, Ted devised a new scheme for a second prison break. Over the following 6 months, he purchased hacksaw blades and prison floor plans from other inmates and enlisted the assistance of his girlfriend Carol to facilitate the smuggling of some of the prison's contraband during a prison visit. Ted accumulated $500 in cash from the sale of contraband within the prison, then utilized the sound created by other inmates in the shower to saw a roughly 1 square foot hole in his cell ceiling. This allowed him to lose 16 pounds, which enabled him to squeeze through the hole. In the following weeks, Ted continued to utilize the nocturnal hours to investigate the ceiling and identify potential escape routes. During this period, unusual sounds emanating from the ceiling were reported by inmates, yet they were not deemed a significant concern by the guards. In the latter part of 1977, Ted filed a motion to change the venue of the trial to Denver on the grounds that the case had already received undue attention in Aspen. This motion was granted by the trial judge. On the evening of December 30th of that year, Ted exploited the fact that the majority of the prison staff had departed for Christmas celebrations and were understaffed to create a mock sleeping dummy using books, clothing, and blankets in his bed. He then proceeded to enter the unoccupied warden's office through the ceiling, don the warden's replacement attire, and subsequently depart the prison through the front entrance. After departing the prison, Ted procured a vehicle and proceeded to leave Glenwood Springs. However, the vehicle soon ceased functioning on Interstate 70, necessitating assistance. A passerby offered Ted a lift to the nearby town of Vail, situated 97 miles away. Subsequently, Ted transferred to a bus in Vail, which transported him to Denver, where he boarded an early morning flight to Chicago. Prison officials at Glenwood Springs Prison were not aware of Ted's escape until noon on December 31st. By that time, he had already reached Chicago. Upon arriving in Chicago, Ted proceeded to Ann Arbor, Michigan, where he procured lodging at a local tavern for the purpose of recuperating and surveying his surroundings. Subsequently, 5 days later, Ted procured a vehicle and proceeded to Atlanta, the capital of Georgia, where he transferred to a bus and ultimately arrived in Tallahassee, the capital of Florida. On January 8th, Ted procured lodging at the Holiday Inn in the vicinity of Florida State University under the assumed name of Chris Hagan. According to Ted's subsequent confession, his initial objective was to secure employment, cognizant that as long as he did not attract the attention of the police, he would enjoy a prolonged period of freedom. However, upon recognizing that the majority of conventional employment opportunities necessitated the presentation of identification, he was compelled to abandon this strategy. Consequently, he resorted to larceny once more, resorting to this practice in order to sustain his expenditure. On January 15, 1978, approximately 1 week after Ted's arrival in Tallahassee, he gained access to Chi Omega, the Florida State University chapter house of a prominent sorority organization, through a rear entrance. There, he perpetrated the homicides of Margaret Bowman, age 21, and Lisa Levy, age 20, and inflicted severe injuries upon Kathy Kleiner and Karen Chandler in the adjacent dormitory room. Kathy subsequently attributed their survival to the sudden illumination of their dormitory room by the headlights of a passing vehicle, which caused Ted to flee in terror. Subsequent to departing from Chi Omega's clubhouse, Ted gained access to a basement apartment situated 8 blocks away. There, he proceeded to assault Cheryl Thomas, an FSU student who resided at the aforementioned location. The attack resulted in Thomas sustaining a dislocated shoulder, 5 fractured bones throughout her body, and ultimately necessitating the cessation of her dance career due to the irreversible consequences of her injuries, including permanent deafness and brain damage. Subsequently, a semen stain was discovered on Cheryl's bed, accompanied by a stocking mask containing 2 hairs believed to belong to Ted. However, at the time, the police lacked the requisite investigative techniques to make an accurate match. Consequently, they were only able to test for blood type and other characteristics, which yielded inconclusive results. On February 8, 1978, Ted drove the stolen van 240 miles east to Jacksonville, where he accosted Leslie Parmenter, the 14-year-old daughter of a Jacksonville Police Department detective, in a parking lot. He claimed to be Richard Burton of the fire department, but immediately fled when Leslie's brother arrived on the scene and questioned him. On that day, Ted proceeded to turn back westward, traversing an additional 97 miles to reach Lake City. The following day, Kimberly Diana Ritchie, a 12-year-old female student at Lake City Junior High School, inexplicably vanished after being summoned by her instructor to retrieve a misplaced item. An exhaustive search was subsequently conducted, resulting in the discovery of Kimberly's remains 7 weeks later in a hog barn situated in proximity to the Suwannee River State Park. The cause of death was determined to be a fatal stabbing to the neck. On February 12th, Ted, in a hurry because he lacked the requisite funds to meet his rental obligations, and because he believed that a police investigation was imminent, procured a vehicle and fled Tallahassee, heading westward toward the Florida Narrows. 3 days later, Pensacola police officer David Lee initiated a traffic stop near a cordon set up by the state of Alabama, suspecting that the vehicle in question was stolen. Upon being informed by David that he was about to be arrested, Ted initiated an assault on the officer and subsequently attempted to evade apprehension. David discharged a warning shot and then initiated a pursuit, during which Ted attempted to seize David's sidearm. Ultimately, David was able to subdue Ted and effect his arrest. Police later recovered 3 student IDs belonging to female FSU students, 21 stolen credit cards, a television, a pair of flat black-rimmed glasses, and a pair of plaid pants from Ted's stolen vehicle. The latter 2 items were revealed to be props he had utilized while assuming the identity of Richard Burton from the fire department. David was unaware that he had arrested one of the FBI's 10 most wanted criminals when he sent Ted to prison. The only reason he had arrested Ted was because Ted had said, "I hope you kill me." In June 1979, Ted was tried in Miami for the Chi Omega homicide and assault. The case attracted significant media attention, with nearly 250 journalists from around the world following the proceedings. It was the first televised trial in the United States. Despite the provision of 5 public defenders by the court, Ted assumed a significant role in the defense himself. Nelson, one of the lawyers assigned to him, later asserted that from the outset, Ted undermined the entire defense out of malice, distrust, and grandiose delusions of grandeur. Facing a grave charge of murder with the potential for a death sentence, Ted's primary objective was to retain control over the proceedings. Another public defender, Mike Minerva, states that following negotiations, a plea bargain was reached. Ted pleaded guilty to the murders of Margaret Bowman, Lisa Levy, and Kimberly Diana Ritchie in exchange for a 75-year prison sentence. The prosecutors were amenable to the deal because the evidence was insufficient and there was a chance of losing the case. Conversely, Ted viewed the plea bargain as a strategic means of avoiding the death penalty, thereby affording him more time to identify potential weaknesses in the evidence and to withdraw his plea and seek an acquittal should the case evolve in his favor. Nevertheless, Ted declined to negotiate at the 11th hour. According to Minerva, this was because he had come to recognize that he would eventually be compelled to acknowledge his guilt in public, a prospect he was unable to face. The most significant testimony presented during the trial was that of Chi Omega member Connie Hastings, who was delayed in arriving at her place of employment and observed Ted exiting the Chi Omega clubhouse with the murder weapon in his possession. The direct forensic evidence presented in the case was a bite wound on the left buttock of Lisa Levy, caused by Ted. This evidence was corroborated by the testimony of forensic odontologists Richard Sauveron and Lowell Levine, who demonstrated that a bite mark on the wound matched a molded cast of Ted's teeth. Following the presentation of the closing arguments, the jury engaged in deliberations for a period of 7 hours, ultimately reaching a verdict on July 24, 1979. Ted was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder, specifically the deaths of Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy, as well as 3 counts of attempted first-degree murder, pertaining to the murders of Kathy Kleiner, Karen Chandler, and Cheryl Thomas. Given the guilty verdicts rendered in the 2 burglary cases, Judge Edward Coward imposed a sentence of death for the aforementioned murders. 6 months later, Ted was tried in Orlando for the murder of Kimberly Diana Ritchie. The jury deliberated for 8 hours and found him guilty. The evidence in this case was more direct, with witnesses observing Ted approaching his stolen FSU truck with Kimberly in tow, and with fibers recovered from the truck and on Kimberly's remains matching the jacket Ted was wearing at the time of his arrest. At the final judgment, Ted cited a statute that is somewhat unconventional in nature. This statute states that a declaration of marriage in a courtroom automatically constitutes a legal marriage in the presence of a judge. Prior to questioning former co-worker Carol, who had already relocated to Florida on his behalf, and testified on his behalf as a character witness in both trials, Ted opened his mouth to question her. When Ted proposed to Carol in court, she accepted his proposal. Thereafter, Ted declared to the court that they were legally married. The sentencing hearing took place on February 10, 1980, and the court imposed a 3rd death sentence on Ted. In October 1981, Carol gave birth to a baby girl and registered Ted as the father. Florida State Prison does not allow spousal visits, but inmates are said to engage in illicit activities with guards to gain access to female visitors. Following the conclusion of the Rich case, Ted initiated a comprehensive appeal. Concurrently, he was subjected to questioning by members of the press, law enforcement, and government agencies upon request. To avoid becoming a witness in court, Ted spoke in a 3rd person when confronted with these questions, disclosing his early offenses and the process of his change of mind. As he recounted, he began stealing at an early age, a fact that confirmed Meg's suspicion that she had frequently lost items during the course of their relationship. According to Ted's account, possessions were also a significant motivator for rape and murder. Ted stated that sexual assault fulfilled his need to own his victims completely. Initially, killing the victim was merely an expedient method for him to avoid being apprehended, but subsequently, murder became an integral aspect of the experience. And the ultimate form of possession is the taking of a life. Ted stated that he considered himself an amateur during his early years, an impulsive killer who did not enter what he referred to as the predator phase until the 1974 murder of Linda Ann Healy. The confession suggests that Ted may have initiated homicides prior to 1974. However, due to his refusal to provide further details, this remains unconfirmed. In July 1984, corrections officers at the Florida State Penitentiary discovered 2 hacksaw blades concealed within Ted's cell. The steel bar affixed to the cell window had been severed from both ends and subsequently affixed with homemade adhesive, composed of soap, and Ted was relocated to an alternative cell. In the subsequent months, prison guards discovered additional unauthorized items in his cell, prompting another transfer. Soon thereafter, he was disciplined for communicating privately with another well-known offender, John Hinckley. In October 1984, Ted commenced composing missives to Robert David Cape. Robert, who had previously served as a principal detective and had recovered a considerable number of crucial statements and eyewitnesses in the Lake Sammamish State Park case, then conducted a comprehensive screening of a multitude of suspects and eventually formulated a suspect list comprising 25 individuals, of whom Ted was one. Robert attempted to conduct an interview with Ted, but was unsuccessful. Robert did not have another opportunity to speak with Ted until his first arrest. Following Ted's arrest, Robert resumed his studies at the University of Washington, pursuing a doctorate while simultaneously serving as a principal researcher for the Washington State Attorney General's office. In 1984, Robert was appointed to participate in the investigation of the Green River Killer case. In response, Ted wrote him a letter in which he analyzed the psychology of serial killers and expressed his hope of being able to assist him in his case. These letters led to an interview, during which Ted confessed to an unidentified murder. In early 1986, the scheduled date for the execution of the perpetrator of the Chi Omega murders was announced initially as March 4th. However, this was subsequently stayed by the U.S. Supreme Court. In April of that year, a new execution date was announced for July 2nd. Following the announcement of the execution date, Ted provided further details of his crimes, including the fact that he would kill his victims and then commit multiple acts of rape until the bodies were too decomposed to do so. Additionally, he would apply makeup and wash the body's hair. At least 12 of his victims were decapitated with a hacksaw, and he would retain the severed heads for a period of time before disposing of them. This would explain why the remains of the victims found on M.T. Taylor consisted only of skulls and a few other bones. On July 1, 1986, less than 15 hours before the scheduled execution, the United States Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit announced an indefinite stay of execution and remanded the Chiamiga murder case for the United States District Court for the Northern District of Florida to review a number of procedural errors at the preliminary hearing. These included a reassessment of the defendant's mental fitness to stand trial and the trial judge's erroneous interference in jury empanelment. The scheduled date for the execution of Rich's sentence was set for November 18th and was likewise postponed indefinitely by the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals on November 17th. In the end, the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Florida rejected all of the arguments presented and declined to reopen the case at the behest of the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. In the aftermath of the unsuccessful appeal, the Florida prosecution promptly announced a definitive execution date of January 24, 1989. Given that all avenues of appeal had been exhausted, Ted agreed to be more forthcoming with investigators. He admitted to Robert Tam that he had committed 8 murders in Washington and Oregon and that he was originally the prime suspect in those murders. However, he also described 3 previously unknown victims and 2 victims he had abducted in Oregon and brought to Washington to kill, but he refused to identify any of the 5 victims. Furthermore, Ted provided a comprehensive account of his abduction of Jorgen Hudgens in an alleyway in downtown Washington. He also disclosed information to detectives from Idaho, Utah, and Colorado regarding multiple homicides that had not been previously disclosed to the authorities. However, his approach shifted when he confessed to the crimes but declined to provide further details. This was due to Ted's intention to postpone the execution by remaining the sole individual with knowledge of the body's whereabouts. Once it became evident that the judicial system was unable to provide further assistance, Ted's supporters initiated a final effort to secure executive clemency. Diana Weiner, the young attorney who was the last person Ted interacted with, has been attempting to persuade several family members of the victims in Colorado and Utah to petition Florida Governor Robert Martinez to allow Ted additional time to divulge further information. However, these requests have been rejected. In his subsequent written account, Nelson states that the families of the victims have come to terms with the reality of their loved ones' deaths at the hands of Ted, and that they no longer require a confession from him. However, Carol, who had maintained her belief in Ted's innocence throughout the trials, felt betrayed when Ted began to plead guilty. As a result, she relocated to Washington, D.C. with her daughter and declined to accept any further phone calls from Ted on the morning of the execution. Since his initial arrest, Ted had consistently denied any involvement in the crimes for which he was charged. It was only after he had exhausted all avenues of appeal and was facing the death penalty that he finally admitted to committing at least 30 murders. In light of Ted's confession regarding at least 10 additional unidentified murders, the actual number of victims remains uncertain. Media speculation ranges from 26 to 100, while caseworkers estimate the figure to be approximately 35. On January 24, 1989, at 7:16 a.m. EST, Ted was executed by electrocution in the electric chair at Florida's Rehoboth prison. During the execution, a multitude of individuals engaged in celebratory activities, including singing, partying, setting off fireworks on the adjacent ranch, and cheering loudly as the white limousine transporting Ted's remains departed the prison grounds. Subsequent to cremation in Gainesville, Ted's ashes were scattered at a confidential location in the Cascade Mountains of Washington state, in accordance with his written instructions.